Hi, welcome to Art Inquiry. I'm Hunter Drohojowska-Philp, and my guest today is Molly Barnes, an art dealer, a curator, an author, a collector, someone who's been in the art world in Los Angeles and also in New York for decades. And we're here today to talk about her origins, how she got started, and what drew her originally to her love of the arts. Hi, Molly.
Hi.
Tell me about the beginning. Let's begin at the beginning. You grew up in Beverly Hills, and tell me a little bit about your family and what your initial exposure was to the art world.
I grew up. My father was in the movie business, and he worked for Hal Wallace, the famous producer who did Casablanca, among others. And every Christmas we would go. It was a requisite that we go to Hal's house and watch him open his Christmas presents. And every year his staff was required to bring him the present of whatever he was collecting. One year it was Steuben glass, one time it was Countess Mara ties, one year it was Sasha Brostov ceramics. And whatever it was, we would have to go watch him open this stuff. And I could see how bored he would get with this. But once he started collecting paintings, I saw his whole attitude change. We'd go there every year and he would be talking about art. Suddenly he was on the board of the LA County Museum, and I thought, this is amazing. And it sort of, I had always been a collector of dolls and whatever was the vogue with kids my age, but suddenly I saw that there could be a real energy and a spiritual aspect to collecting. And I saw what it did to him, and that began festering in me. I started thinking all the time about, what do I want to do? What do I want to be when I grow up? I can't be an artist because I can't stand being alone more than a few hours. I like to sell. And so I hit on collecting, and invariably with an art dealer, you become your house is too small for your collection. So you begin selling art.
What was the first purchase you ever made of a work of art? If you can remember.
Well, when I was at Berkeley, I collected Charles Surendorf. I had to do a theme, a paper in an art class, and he was an artist actually working near Berkeley. And I was enchanted by his work and the idea of meeting a real artist and seeing how artists were different than the family, which was very conservative, that I grew up with. Then when I got to the New York scene and the art world in New York through my first husband, the thing I first bought, I think, was a Herman Cherry, because Herman was a conduit for all of us who were young and available to meet the art world. And I thought that my buying something of his would help me get into the art world.
And that would have been an abstract painting.
Yeah.
So you really began in a very complicated kind of art. You were buying abstract painting, which is not necessarily something everybody can relate to.
I lived next door to a painter named Joan Mitchell, and she was married to a man named Barney Rossett, who had started the Grove Press and Evergreen Review, and brought a lot of well, I'm trying to think, some of the writers from Europe, D.H. Lawrence, he got them into this country and got their work published. And she was a fabulous character. And my first husband was always traveling, and so I got to know her, and she took me to meet all the artists.
And of course, she was an abstract painter.
Fantastic. And she made it seem like if you weren't involved with that kind of art, she didn't want to have anything to do with you. So because I wanted to be in her good graces, started really paying attention, and that was my opening. And it was funny because very few women had any power in the art world at that time, the early days of abstract expressionism. And I remember Elaine de Kooning saying once, when asked, what do you suggest to women artists? She said, marry well. And that's what Joan had done, because it gave her not only the clout, but the money so she could paint.
That's right. And art dealers, you said, I think, had a similar problem, some of them.
In what way?
In that it's not necessarily that easy to make money as an art dealer, especially at the beginning.
Well, at that time, I remember when I thought of the idea of opening a gallery, and somebody said to me, art dealers are one of four minorities. They're gay, they're alcoholic, they're women, or they're Jewish. And it seemed to me that at that time, this was the late 60s, everybody who was making it in the art world as a dealer was a woman, because they were very nurturing, and it was a profession that women could do with impunity.
Absolutely. And who was the first, didn't you know Martha Jackson very early? Tell me about what your relationship with her was like.
Martha Jackson was an artist, an art dealer who handled a lot of second-generation artists. She had Jack Youngerman.
Abstract expressionist artists.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember she gave me a lot of, what?
In New York.
In New York, yeah. She was right on Madison Avenue and 68th. And she gave me a lot of advice. One, she said, you have to have 12 collectors who will buy only from you, who will not just decorate their walls and then stop collecting, but will become obsessed with buying. And when you have these collectors, you have to go to every party they give, you have to go to their children's bar mitzvahs, you actually become a part of each of their families. And as she said, it was exhausting, and it was. I could never get 12, but I got 3. And then she said you have to wait 5 to 10 years before you'll start making any kind of money. And I think a lot of people don't realize that you have to not only pay your dues, but you're just scraping. You have to find a backer, or you have to find somebody who's going to help you out, because it's impossible to pay the rent and make money the first couple of years.
Now, before you opened your gallery, of course, you met a few more artists along the way. I think you became friends with William de Kooning. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It's funny, his daughter was here in Los Angeles this week. Her daughter is doing a surfing movie, and so I took them to Ojai. She wanted to interview an expert on surfing, and I took them up to meet this artist, Nick, I'm trying to think of his last name, Reinman. And I left, and she bought a painting from Nick. I thought, oh my God, I felt very funny about that. When I met Bill de Kooning, it was 1965. And I used to hang around all the time, the art world in East Hampton, where he lived. And I'd hang around always trying to meet him. And I went to a party at Barney Rossett's, and I looked around at all the artists who were there. Barney was living in a Quonset hut, actually, that had belonged to Bob Motherwell in the best part of East Hampton. And I looked around, and everybody was trying to get to de Kooning. It was very interesting to see where the power was in that room. Although he wasn't very big, he was extraordinarily powerful. And I remember I was introduced to him, and he said, "Oh, nice legs." And I thought, wait. And I was just splitting up with my first husband at that time. But I had heard that after Pollock died, he would go to the post office every day with his driver and get his mail at 10:30. And I knew he liked Marilyn Monroe. And although I certainly don't look like Marilyn Monroe, at that time I was young and had this dress that looked a little like something she would wear. So every day I would stand out in front of the post office at 10:30. And finally, after 10 days, his driver came over and said, "Mr. de Kooning would like to meet you." And I went, oh. I tell that story, and a lot of feminists think, oh, you were trading on something we don't approve of. But I remember that I went over and met him in his truck, and he invited me to lunch. And John McMahon, his driver, said, "Would you drive him home afterward, because I have errands to do." So we spent the afternoon talking, and then I drove him home. And it seemed like I was, you know how artists are very standoffish, and then they just let you right into their life, and it's like you've always been there. And so that started a friendship that lasted about 15 years, actually. It's funny, when he died, I hadn't seen him in the last couple of years because Lisa, his daughter, kept his privacy sacrosanct. But I went back to the memorial, and 17 years before, I had left a bracelet on the bathroom sink. And when I went back for the memorial, I walked into the bathroom, and there was my bracelet. 17 years later. And of course I took it. It was just a very inexpensive bracelet, but it was so funny with this very, very sterile room. There was my bracelet. And I remembered the first night I met him, when we went back to his studio, there were a lot of people waiting for him because he'd been with me in the afternoon. And he had a lot of things in the bathroom that people could steal because he didn't want them to take the paintings or the drawings. So their theory was that if they had paper towels and maybe little tchotchkes around the bathroom, that people would be, you know, tempted to take that or a matchbook or something rather than get into heavy thievery.
And your bracelet was still there.
My bracelet was still there.
That's extraordinary. Now, you knowing de Kooning, knowing Joan Mitchell, those are friendships with artists, and that could have been as far as it went, and it probably would have been for most people. What then kind of got you to go to the next level where you thought you could actually sell works of art?
I had been looking all my life for spiritual answers. I hadn't necessarily found it in the Episcopal Church. And when I spent time with de Kooning and Joan Mitchell, I was transported to another level. It's like when you look at their paintings, there's something in it that just resonates or vibrates. I don't know what part of you is touched, but emotionally, I feel it in my skin. And when I was with them, I just felt this sense of peace. And I just kept going back to de Kooning's year after year, and thinking I would be an artist, and then suddenly realized my job was not to create, but to actually give the spiritual aspects that I'd gotten to people who I'd grown up with. Mm-hmm. I'd grown up here in a very conservative family, and I thought what I want to do is teach them, the people I grew up with, this spirituality that's available through art.
So 2 years after meeting de Kooning, I think that's about when you opened your gallery on La Cienega Boulevard.
1967, yeah.
And what was La Cienega Boulevard like at that time? I mean, what other galleries were there? Ferris Gallery, of course.
I worked for a number of dealers when I came back in '65. Mike Blankford got me an introduction to Rolf Nelson, who had
Mike Blankford was a producer, I believe, and also a big art collector here.
Yeah,
yes?
And his daughter and Peter Clothier's wife is actually an art consultant. When I came back after that first summer, I met, Mike Blankford took me to meet Rolf Nelson, who was looking for somebody to work for him. And Rolf was, at that time, married to Frank Gehry's sister. And Rolf was not what we considered the top gallery. The Ferris Gallery was #1. Nick Wilder was there. He was maybe #2. And it was sort of I think the reason Rolf wasn't taken as seriously as the other two was that he, rather than showing one school, like either pop art or minimal art or whatever was at that time, he showed what he considered the best.
Well, he showed that giant George O'Keeffe
That's
painting
just what I was going to
Clouds
say.
Above the Sky, and nobody else would show it, and nobody would even buy it from him.
And that was his, he went under after that. He, you know, he had to guarantee the shipping, and it was only $75,000. And today it's worth, what, $10 million? I mean,
probably.
And
it's at the Art Institute of Chicago, should anybody be interested.
They bought it? God, it was a beautiful painting. And the way you can tell, I think, a good painting like that was, it was all these clouds, and then there was one little cloud sort of going off by itself, similar to what Ed Moses did in the 60s with the little birds, and then one bird was looking a different direction. But what I saw was, I would see nature after looking at a painting like that, and all of my perception was changed for a while. I remember going to Hawaii, and suddenly I saw the clouds that George O'Keeffe had talked about. I saw how the sky was so important to the ground, and it was something that I realized it was really as a result of looking at that painting for so many years.
Now, who else did Rolf Nelson show while you were there?
Heinz Mock, Ian Baxter, George Herms, Lynn Folks, Joe Good. And it was amazing because he showed the people that other people wouldn't necessarily show because it wasn't a part of their image. And yet he showed wonderful artists. And
then after that, did you open your own gallery?
Yeah. Somebody came by the gallery and said, it was somebody I'd gone to high school with, and he said, I'd like to open a gallery, and could we go into business together? I'll put up the money and it will be your expertise. So I took him to New York and introduced him to de Kooning and all of the artists who were around at that time.
And what was the address of your gallery?
Let me think, 650 North La Cienega.
So very much in the thick of everything, near Ferris and near the other galleries in the area.
Yeah, and I remember people, I had worked, I got a couple of jobs. I worked for Herb Palmer, who was at that time very briefly in business with, what's his name, Dick Feigen. And I learned a lot about the art world from them because they were showing John Cage. Oh, actually, we had a concert of John Cage, and it was silence. You know, it was just X amount of minutes in silence. And that also had a big effect on me. I thought, music doesn't have to be structured. It's the idea of ambient sound that should be as important as the music. And let me think who else they showed. They showed wonderful, wonderful artists. And then when I actually opened my own gallery, my thrust was to be the second generation abstract expressionist. I remember asking Bill de Kooning if I could show his work, and he tried for me, but his dealer said no. And he said, why don't you just call the gallery Bill's? I remember that. But I showed second generation people from the abstract expressionist world. My first show was, he was married to Grace Borgnick, Warren Brandt. Do you remember him? And then I showed Ray Parker, I showed Jack Youngerman, I showed Frank Roth. And it was so expensive shipping art from the East Coast to the West Coast, because as dealers we had to pay one way. And I started thinking I should start showing LA people. It was funny, I showed, Vasarely was my second show. And he was living in Paris, and the show was the first time he'd showed egg tempras on the West Coast. So Felix Landau, who lived across the street, who had the gallery across the street, came in to see my show, and I said, oh, it's such an honor, such a privilege to have the great Felix Landau here. And he talked to the powers who be, who were the handlers for Vasarely, and the next day the van came and took all the Vasarelys across the street to Felix. He had told them that I was too new to know what I was doing. And I thought, either you can get mad or you can get even. You can, you know, yell and scream, or you can wait till your time comes and get back at him.
And what was the show that you had after Vasarely?
Ray Parker. And I remember, what's his name bought the one that had been on the cover. He was the president of the Pasadena Museum. What was his name?
Robert Rowan.
Yeah, Robert Rowan bought that piece. And I sold 3 or 4 pieces, and everybody loved Ray Parker. But I could just see that this was so expensive, trying to ship everything, that's when I began trying to show West Coast people.
And who was your first West Coast? Well, George Herms is from the West Coast, obviously.
Yeah, I can't remember who the first one was. I was looking, in preparation for this morning, I was looking through my, my scrapbook of the 60s. I can't remember.
Well, how did you come to show John Baldessari, which seems so far afield from second-generation abstract expressionism?
Well, I had learned from Rolf that you were no longer committed to just show one school of art. And I would sit at my desk in the front until I could only afford to have a secretary or assistant twice a week. And so every artist in town would come in, you know, they'd heard I had a gallery and I was getting publicity. So John came in one day, and it was before he knew how to dress properly. I mean, what I mean is now he wears sloppy clothes, but everything is very expensive and coordinated. At that time, he just came in off the street, and I thought, who is this guy? And he showed me these boxes he'd made that blipped out art phrases. And I don't know, there was something about him that was so winning, and he was teaching, all his students were people like Eric Fischel, David Anton had, you know, was very influenced by him. But there was something about him that just intrigued me. And I asked him if he wanted to have a show. And he had 3 shows with me. And there was something about him that was just extraordinarily intriguing.
Did he show the paintings with the photograph and the text at your gallery?
Yeah. You of course know the Magritte show that just closed. But that piece of his phrases not to use when you're describing art, that was the first announcement we sent out, was a poster of that, where he felt that people were getting so meaningless in their descriptions of the art world and phrases describing art. So he wrote out 60 words that you don't use ever.
Well, he's now considered sort of a pioneer of conceptual art, but at the time, did you have a characterization of that kind of art that he was making? Would you have called it conceptual art?
I don't know what I would have called it. I never even thought about it until this minute. I don't know. It was very satirical. Also, he was extremely smart. And I felt that a lot of things he was saying were early put-downs of the pomposity of the art world, but also he was reaching something. I've never really thought about that. I can't even answer your question. But I did do those, showed those really bad photographs of National City and art phrases, and they were amazing.
Did you sell any of them?
One I sold, yeah, we sold a lot.
Oh.
And then one I sold in a Whitney retrospective of his work. And he agreed, he had given it to me as a gift. And I sold it, and I asked if it was okay. And I bought my apartment in New York with the money. So that was a really good thing, and I'm always grateful to him for that. I sort of believe that things happen as they're supposed to, and that we're kind of guided along that way.
Do you remember how much his work sold for in the early days?
I think it was $125 for those little tiny ones.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they were just nothing, and yeah, people did buy them. There was a group of. My dream was always to show the WASPs out here, the trust fund babies, art and get them to buy. And they were so slow. But the show business people were the people who started coming immediately. And they understood the affinity between show business and the art world. There was a different language and a different jargon and a different need to create. But those are the people that started coming in early on. Danny Melnick, Dick Dorso, Norman Lear, they started coming in and buying out of my shows.
Well, they had a great affinity for pop art, which was very much the thing in the 1960s, especially at the Ferris Gallery. Did you show anybody who you would consider a pop artist?
Let me think. Do you remember Rick Harold? He was an erotic artist, actually, but he worked in the hard-edge techniques of pop art. And I remember I showed him, and the work was really pornographic, but it was kind of subtle because it was silver on silver, so you couldn't quite see it. And he hired a male model to lie on the floor of the opening, and he was supposed to have a woman down there. They were supposed to make love, and I was so, like, anything, you know. But he could never find a woman, so he had this guy always lying on this bed. And David Stewart, who was next door, tried to have an erotic art show in conjunction with mine, and he was arrested. His show was confiscated, but for some reason mine wasn't. I'm trying to think of some, Mike Peters. I can't think of any of the pop artists. Well, Bob Cottingham, but he was more of a photorealist. I don't know. I can't remember.
Well, earlier you said that also you were the first to show Eleanor Anton, and that John Baldessari introduced you to the work.
Yeah.
What was her first show like?
It was collages. It was quite different than a more outspoken version. But I remember that she did a portrait show at the LA County Museum, and she just had, for me, I mean, I'm embarrassed to even say this. It was just like a bathroom mat with some pills on it. I was so horrified. I went to see it. There's a portrait of me, and then I thought.
Oh, yeah, so we don't want to go down that road too far. What were the Monday night art walks like? Were you part of that when people would come and walk up and down La Cienega to visit the galleries?
Oh, Hunter, that was so much fun. I think that it got so that people thought it's a cheap date. I remember Mike Silverman, who was at that time a well-known realtor in Beverly Hills, would bring a different woman every week. And you knew it was because he didn't have to pay, and he could come, and we all felt obligated in the galleries to have some wine, to have some brie. I mean, we really knocked ourselves out. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience that we'd get maybe 300 or 400 people on a Monday night.
And there are collectors who've come out of that, people who...
Like who?
Well, I've talked to different people over the years, and they've said their introduction to the art world was really through those Monday night art walks. They would have been intimidated to go by themselves to those galleries, but when they were with a group, they could go and
I remember Al Ruddy, who produced the Godfather movies. I remember he used to come and bring different dates. And yeah, we always had the same regulars. Warren Waltz, who was a landscape architect, and a lot of people would just come week after week. And we sort of had a salon, and that's what I've always thought was fun about having a gallery, is that it becomes a salon. People drop in, and it's sort of the same cast of characters. There's always a fight or two. People are meeting and starting to date, and I mean, it was just a wonderful experience, yeah.
It's very different from the art world of today, I would say.
What would you say, what's the art world like to you today?
It's just a much larger, I guess it's not different, it's just a much larger version of what you were experiencing then. But if you had to give advice to someone today who is starting a gallery, what would it be?
Well, you know, Hunter, I think that Culver City now is very much like the art world was for us in the 60s. It's like a frontier town. I remember all the galleries that we had on the 60s, Ferris, Nick, all of them. The walls were kind of shabby. The floorboard never quite matched the floor. The floor, oh, I remember showing Les Levine and he just poured paint on the floor of my gallery. There's a pop artist. But it was very much like a pioneer spirit. Mm-hmm. Everybody would help each other. And that's what I feel about Culver City today. I go to those galleries and you can walk. One, you could park and you could go to all of them. Everybody's very friendly and they all have this feeling that we're going to make this happen. I love that. I can't remember what your question was.
That was, and if you had to do it all over again, would you have made the same decisions?
For me, the excitement of art is not selling. There are some dealers who just get really excited and that's their deal is when they make that. I mean, you look at Iris Spangerman or somebody like that, and they just, that's it. They live for that. Mine was more teaching people about what art was about and how it could benefit them, what it could do for them.
Thank you. That's just perfect. That's all the time we have for, but I really enjoyed having you here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Molly Barnes talking to us about her time in the 1960s. I'm Hunter Drohojowska-Philp.
Thank you.
Oh,